Well, it's very good to be here today. I want to thank, before we begin, Marcus Smith and his team at Thinking Aloud, very generously allowing us to interview distinguished guest, Chee Dimock, who's the William Lampson Professor of English and American Studies at Yale University, and who's visiting BYU to talk about a couple different events. One, a discussion about a new article, and another, a work in progress, sort of a discussion with faculty. We could talk a lot about your background. You come from Hong Kong, isn't that right? And one story that would be interesting to get to would be just how you get from Hong Kong to being a professor of American literature at Yale. Very briefly, what is the trajectory that gets you from point A to point B?
Okay, so I started out as a teenager going to public libraries a lot. The apartments in Hong Kong were and are tiny. So in the summer, the best place to go would be library. So I was really bookish. And it occurred to me that it would be good to go to a place where there would be a lot of books. You know, the public library in Hong Kong was good, but it was small. So, I thought about applying, and I did apply, and I got into Harvard with a big fellowship, which was scholarship, which was quite necessary. And from there, it was just one thing after another. I mean, after college, it seemed kind of reasonable to apply to graduate school, and then I applied for jobs.
Yeah.
So it wasn't very well planned out at the outset. But I was extremely lucky. But I think that I was also lucky in the sense that various people were reaching out to me at various points. There were teachers. My teachers were crucial in encouraging me to apply to begin with, and writing recommendations for me. College teachers who encouraged me to go on. So I guess from the very beginning, I got the sense that for some students, encouragement from teachers was absolutely crucial. And this is really what I hope to do as well as reaching out to people who might not have thought of, trying to try out for this kind of professional life, also to reach out to those people.
Well, that's wonderful. I have talked to people who have taken classes from you. They talk about what an excellent mentor you've been. So you certainly have been successful in that respect. You've also been very influential in the profession of literary studies. I mean, one thing that I love about your work, and I'm not an Americanist, but it's work of big ideas. And I wanted to ask you about one of these big ideas in your work. You published a book a few years ago called Through Other Continents, whose subtitle really captured the critical imagination, American Literature Across Deep Time. And that phrase, deep time, what does that mean, and how do we imagine American literature, going back not hundreds but thousands of years? What does that mean?
Well, I think BYU is the perfect place. BYU is surrounded by all these magnificent mountains.
Right.
This is the perfect place to think about longer time frames that is beyond the biological lifespan of single individuals. So, I mean, of course, in the humanities, it couldn't really be millions of years, that kind of or astronomical time, it couldn't be really that long. But I think that we do have at our disposal thousands of years of recorded linguistic use. And so my idea is to refer back, to those very earliest records. And it just so happens that living poets and living novelists are also reaching back to the very long time frames and the linguistic records from long time ago. So, one example, and that is really encouraging to me, is the contemporary poet, Pulitzer Prize winning poet Yusuf Kumayaka. He just staged the Mesopotamian epic Gilgamesh. He put it on stage. So, it was performed in Chicago, it was performed in New York City, Boston, New Orleans. And so that for me is the living example of an ancient text being brought to life again.
That's
And
great.
it's,
So it's American literature because it's
yeah,
contemporary
no, it's
play,
contemporary. Yeah,
and yet it's based on something much, much deeper, with a much longer
exactly.
history. And again, how that gets from the ancient world into the modern world, lots of stories built in there too.
Yeah.
Which raises the question, really, how deep can we go? I'm thinking about other current critics. Mark McGurl at Stanford University has written about geological deep time, and he says
Right.
that, when we think about the billions of years in the Earth's formation, there's an existential kind of crisis for
Yes.
humans. Like
Right.
we're here for such a short time that the literature takes up those existential questions. Your colleague at Yale, Gary Tomlinson, a musicologist, has written
Yes.
about evolutionary biology.
Yes.
He's studying how humans acquire the capacity for rhythm
Right.
and music and
Yes.
song and eventually story. How far back productively can we go in deep time, you think, before we really run out of the capacity really to imagine ourselves back that far?
Well, I think that language is, in that sense, not the best evidence that we have. Certainly, visual records go back much further, sort of cave paintings, and to some extent, music as well, so non-verbal records of human expression go back much further than that. And then I think, in fact, this is a good moment to think about the interconnections between linguistic use and non-linguistic uses. So, I would argue that we in the humanities really need to think a lot more about interconnections from going from literature to the arts, and maybe even to some other human expressions that so far have not been roped into that discussion, such as food, material, use of material resources. Those also go back very far. So, cooking, I would argue, that should really be
That's
a
great.
food, should really be an important
Right.
part of the study of literature.
Yeah, there's this great Levi-Strauss book, The Raw and the Cooked, and how cooking might actually sort
Right.
of become a metaphor for things that go back that far. It's very interesting
Yeah,
as a thought.
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Let me ask you about that the subtitle of that book, American Literature Across Deep Time, was so very captivating. I'm wondering about the title of the book, Through Other Continents. I've got a colleague in the English department, Brian Roberts, who's interested in archipelagos
Yes.
and relation of small off-continental spaces and oceanic spaces to larger land masses. For you, was the idea of the continent central to that project, or were continents a metaphor for talking about other sort of national spaces around the globe?
That's a great question. I think I started out simply by thinking about continents as an alternative set of geographical coordinates, that are not just national boundaries. So mostly it was in relation to and in contradistinction from national boundaries. That's how I started out. But now I think that actually I want to take the idea of continents as a kind of a physical geographical formation much more seriously. And in conjunction with that, also think about oceans, that there would have been no continents if there had not been oceans.
Right.
So the two of them actually are not opposed. In fact, they are part of the same continuum, the same kind of analytic field. Once you start talking about continents, you have to start thinking about oceans and the way the oceans are interconnected. In fact, oceans make a much better case for interconnections because there's really nothing separating the Indian Ocean from the Pacific Ocean from the Atlantic, really, Mediterranean even. So, it just stands to reason that there would have been all kinds of exchanges going through those oceans.
That's a great point. I remember years ago talking to an historian, a Scottish historian, talking about lowland Scotland into highland Scotland, which gets from sort of flat, fertile territory to very mountainous terrain. And his point was always that oceans don't divide, oceans connect. It was easier to travel across oceans than it was across land for many thousands of years.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which speaks to that
Right.
point.
Yeah. So, I think that also a lot of major religions really take on a different meaning. I think that right now, just one, Islam, for instance, when you think about that, it's I think that right now it has basically a kind of a negative connotation, in the minds of lots of people. But if we start thinking about Islam in a longer time frame and also within an oceanic context. Actually, Islamic scholars were responsible for preserving Aristotle, for preserving all the ancient Greek texts when they would have been destroyed elsewhere. They were translated into Arabic, and that's how they were preserved. And they were also great sea travelers. So they were responsible for spreading human civilization all over the globe. And so if we think about Islam in that long civilizational perspective as opposed to narrowly theological perspective, we have a totally different sense of Islam.
That's fascinating. That really is. Let me ask you, speaking about sort of ancient civilizations and ancient literary forms, you've become very interested in epic.
Yes.
Well, I don't know for how, maybe this goes back a long, long time, but certainly you've written about it in recent years. Last year we had Ursula Heise of UCLA out, and she's doing interesting things with biodiversity databases as a new species of epic.
Absolutely.
Why do you think there is so much new attention to the epic, or what draws you to the epic as a literary form?
Well, I mean, I think the epic is a great instance of exactly the kind of biodiversity that Ursula is talking about, you know, in terms of literature. My idea of epic is actually just any kind of long-running story that gets told over and over again with multiple variants. So my conception of epic is that, you know, if we think about the Homeric epics, you know, they were recited by all those people, each with his or her own, probably just his own version, going from village to village, you know, so every single recitation would be different. So from day one, there were multiple variants. And now, you know, you have Margaret Atwood telling her own story from Penelope's point of view, from May's point of view.
Good.
I mean, it's just really, it just never stops. So it is a genre that, you know, that first of all diversifies in unpredictable ways, in ways that quite often go against the original. And my idea is that they also diversify in a kind of downward direction, that is, they get more and more popular. So, you know, when we have Homer, the Homeric epic, becoming part of a TV series such as Star Trek, you know, that's, for me, it's a high point. It's a low point for some people. It's a high point for me.
Right, good. Excellent. One of the things I've read that you've sort of said about epic is that it really is an absorptive medium. It picks up all kinds of various forms and works them through, and it's very eclectic. And I'm wondering about your work. You know, you trace things back over time and across, you know, sort of multiple regions of the globe. And oftentimes today, projects like that are big digital humanities projects, right? That kind of amass large amounts of data. They look for patterns. Do you find that your work, whether or not it actually does digital things, is informed by these kinds of trends of thinking? Do you find that you draw upon those other kinds of hot topics in the humanities or the arts that informs how you think about traditional genres like epic?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think Facebook actually has had significant impact.
Great.
On the way I teach and also the way I think about literature. And I've had the Facebook, I have two actually, but one is quite large. It's over 4,000 people. It's a closed group, but it's over 4,000, in fact, almost fully 500 members. And so it's basically self-sustaining at this point. You know, I just post maybe just once a week, and other people post all the time. But when it was first starting out, it was much smaller. I used to be quite anxious about making sure that there would be something there, right? So I would be posting all the time, and I just had to post something. I just had to write much faster, and I think that actually in turn led me to think of myself as possibly writing in a somewhat different manner from my academic writing. And so now I actually write movie reviews for the LA Review of Books.
That's fantastic.
So, I mean, there's definitely is a kind of time pressure for that. You know, you can write months after the movie has come out. I mean, ideally you write when the movie is still running, you know, so that people will go and see it. And they're pretty good about publishing it fairly rapidly. The turnover time is very fast. So I started out just doing that for the Great Gatsby. I've taught a course on Fitzgerald, so it's no big deal. It's part of a panel of scholars writing on the Great Gatsby. But once I did that, I realized that I really wanted to write about movies. So I think I'll keep on doing that. And so that's a totally different genre writing, popular, and I just know that a lot more people are going to be reading those movie reviews than anything else I've done.
Oh yeah,
So
absolutely.
it changes my rhythm of work quite a bit. And in
That's
terms
interesting. Yeah.
of MOOCs, actually that has had tremendous impact.
MOOCs, M-O-O-C, massive
Massive
open online
online
courses. Yeah, quite
courses.
the discussion
Yeah.
topic today in universities.
Yes. So I've taught a course called an Open Yale course that is not a MOOC. Some people call it a kind of a precursor to the MOOC. I prefer to think of it as a much looser kind of thing. There are no exams there, certainly they're not credit bearing. They were funded also by a nonprofit foundation, the Hewlett Foundation. And now they've sort of stopped funding that, so there are no more new Open Yale courses. But the old, existing Open Yale courses are just free for people to go and, if you've read a novel by Faulkner, Fitzgerald in my case, or Hemingway, and you just want to hear just one lecture, you go and hear that one lecture, that's it. There's nothing else. And I think that's a much better model based on interest of the listeners or viewers, just to get the one thing that they want, as opposed to a course that people are supposed to sign up for, and take the entire course. That doesn't really work out all that well, because all the news that's been coming out about the MOOCs is that the attrition rate is extremely high. Very few people actually finish the course.
Right.
So by that measure, MOOCs are not a success. But if courses are to be designed to spur interest on the part of viewers and or listeners, and just to sustain that interest and broaden that interest, then that would be a somewhat different goal. And I think that online education should also have a kind of a local component. So actually, I've used some of the online features that's been developed by things like such as Coursera. Coursera is actually quite innovative in terms of thinking about new teaching strategies. So one thing that they use is peer comments or peer grading,
Right.
Which I've used now in my regular teaching. So for instance, in my freshman seminar, students have to write an outline for the paper that they want to write. If they're planning to write a paper, they have to write an outline first. The outline gets read by two people, myself and one other student in the class, and both the outline and the comments are posted online for everyone in the class to look at. So if you go to my freshman, it's on the website. If you go to that freshman seminar, you'll see 50 some outlines and responses there. And then I post the sample papers, not all the papers from that batch, but just 3. And if people who bother to check the relation between, I also gave them some prompts to begin with, to check the relation between the prompts and the final papers that get posted, they'll see that in fact there's no relation. The best papers were papers, or what I find the most interesting papers, I wouldn't say they're the best, but the most interesting papers were by people who looked at the prompts and decided they were going to write about something else. So there's also an element of encouraging them to think on their own. So that whole process makes them much more independent than they would have been.
That's very interesting. These online courses have become quite a subject of discussion amongst academics, in part because people realize with the rising costs of education, it's harder for a larger number of people around the globe to get to universities.
Yes.
What do you think the obligation is of scholars to engage larger communities outside of their own institutions? I mean, is that something I know you've done a lot of work in the public humanities, movie reviews to MOOCs, right? That would be its own kind of interview, actually, or course or maybe an essay title. What do you think the obligation is of scholars vis-a-vis communities?
I think that we should really work harder in that direction. It is good to be responsible to our students within the classroom. But I think that we should also, at this point, we should also think of the classroom in a much broader sense. There are people who've paid the tuition and so who are enrolled in our classes, and we certainly have an obligation, scholars have an obligation towards those people who are actually enrolled. But then there are other people who would have wanted to enroll who don't have the resources or the time, or who are just too far away, to be in the actual classroom. And I think that we have an obligation towards them as well. So my teaching strategy now is to put as much as possible online, and so the people who want to could access it. I mean, putting the paper topics and so on, sample papers. Ideally, I hope that we'll be able to put a couple of class sessions, and I especially would want to put my freshman seminars, a couple of sessions of that online, just so that people can see what freshmen look like and how they talk. And I would say the American classroom is a relatively democratic place. Anyone who wants to talk can. And people are relatively attentive to other people, respectful of other people, responsive to other people. All these are very important virtues. I mean, it's one of the things that we should be proud about, and should have an effect on, or at least be open for anyone who wants to see, to know that such a thing really exists. That there's no reason why that expression should not be more open in other contexts.
Yeah, sure.
So I think the classroom, the kind of discussion that is possible in the classroom, quite often because it's just to talk about a work of literature, and therefore, it's not kind of high policy or critical, it's any kind of critical foreign policy issue. It's not to discuss those issues, but because to talk about a work of literature, people are freer. But that's a very good model, to my mind, of democratic discussion.
Good. Yeah, excellent. We're here right now taping this for the radio. And isn't it true that you were consultant for a series on world literature that aired on PBS? So how did this come about?
Well, I mean, it was produced by WGBH, and so they've had a long-standing. And WGBH actually is the TV, and PBS. But they also have an educational foundation, which is they produce videos for nonprofit educational foundations. In this case, it's the Annenberg Foundation that approached them, and they wanted to do a series on world literature. It's mostly for the benefit of community colleges. So, I think that they were distributed for free by the foundation. And meanwhile, because it had been produced, it was also aired on PBS, not on all stations, but I think probably, just in maybe 50 stations or something like that.
Just still, that's pretty significant.
Yeah, that was pretty significant.
Stations.
Yeah, it was in Connecticut. It was certainly in Boston. And the idea is that it brings together. I love the idea is to bring together academic and non-academic people. So the strong emphasis is actually on performers, dancers who would interpret Gilgamesh in a particular way.
Or Gilgamesh, yes.
Yeah. No, that was a wonderful program.
Yep.
Our poets talking about, how they would go back to, to other poets and respond to those. Let me try to think. And a lot of staging going on as well. So in that case, it really suggests a different way in which the university could see itself as part of a larger community.
Yes, good, wonderful. We have about 2 minutes left. So as we kind of wrap up here, What are some things happening right now in the world of literary studies that you think are most exciting, most interesting? I mean, if you were talking to an audience about things happening in the university or in culture that suggest interesting new directions of thought, what are those?
Well, I mean, I think that one thing, just to go back to food and literature, I think that a lot more could be done with that. So, you know,
I have colleagues who will be very happy to hear that. A few of them have actually written books and
yeah,
articles about food.
yeah,
Folklorists.
folklore, right. So, I mean, it has so many, just to take that as one example, there's so many different directions we could go. You know, one is a kind of anthropological, folkloric approach. So taking in a much broader range of cultures than we tend to do at the moment,
Yes.
literate as well as non-literate. That would be a scholarly way to think about this. Another is in the direction of public humanities. So I've been thinking, and in fact, it was the idea of students to have a kind of a food truck festival in
That's
New
a
Haven.
great
Yeah,
What a
you
fun
know, because
idea.
there's so many food trucks and they're all
Yeah.
ethnic, you know, food. I mean, we have
It's a great
right,
idea.
you know, Mexican food, you
Yeah.
know, all kinds. I mean, food trucks are an important feature of New Haven. So, you know, we could have that in conjunction with a class. You know, I have a class called American Literature in the World. And I would love to have, you know, some kind of food truck festival as the concluding event also of an annual graduate conference as well. So that would be another way is to reach out to your local community, to the city, and
Good.
bring the entire city, just an occasion to celebrate, you know, what people already know about the city, but just to highlight that one feature.
That's a great idea.
And I think that, you know, once we have you know, a kind of food or food truck festival, then there's got to be music in
Yeah.
there, right? So that would be one kind of a natural place where the performing arts and the more academic humanities can come and mingle, and you know, really draw strength from each other. In terms of food, another dimension that I would want to just to call attention to is the relation food is related to public health.
Yeah.
And so I think that is a very interesting new trend in something called medical humanities. Is that medical
Good.
schools apparently are paying attention much more to the power of narratives. So a lot of medical schools actually have that as a kind of a component, you know, that they have the lecture series, they have the readings actually with novelists coming and doing the readings, they have classes on narratives. The idea, I think, partly is to get doctors to pay attention to the stories the patients are telling. So, you know, first of all, it's much more of a kind of bi-directional approach. It's not just the doctors giving advice to, you know, medical advice to the patients, but the patients actually have something to tell the doctors as well, you know, that I live my life in a certain way.
Right.
And quite possibly, you know, the symptoms are related to the way I live my life. So that would be really a kind of a low tech, but absolutely crucial kind of information that really should be feeding into the system that right now I'm not sure is really, you know, is being highlighted to the extent that it should. So there's that kind of a patient narrative component. But I think that beyond that, medical schools, schools of public health can do so much to encourage literacy in the rest of the world. You know, both
Yeah.
medical literacy, but also just general literacy.
Good.
And I'm convinced that the best way to do it is actually by asking people to read or to tell stories together. You know, it's the low tech aspect of it that for me, low cost, low tech aspect of it that makes literature so vital. That
Yeah.
anything that's dependent on complicated equipment
Yeah.
can only go so far.
Good. That's the genius of it, really. In a high-tech world, we need low-tech solutions. It's
Exactly.
a great way to end, great note to end on. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to have Chee Dimock here at BYU. Thank you for taking time to sit down for the interview.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you to the team here. It's just been a great pleasure to be part of this. Thank you.